Hello, my name is Jost Zetzsche. I'm an English to German translator, and chances are that most of you don't know me because of me being a translator, but because you've read some of the stuff that I've written over the last few years. For many years now, I've been writing about translation technology. I'm the author of a fairly widely read newsletter. I also have written a book about translation technology, and in the last year I co-authored and published a book called Found in Translation, which tries to show that the world as it is today wouldn't be and couldn't go on as it is if it wouldn't be for the work of translators and interpreters. In this talk, I'd like to look at both of these things. I want to look at translation technology, how it has changed and how it's influencing our work as translators. But I also want to look at translation from a more profound level. I want to share some of those stories with you about how translators truly affect the world and how what you and I are doing changes the world and makes the world safer every day. The title for my talk, The End of the World for Translation as We Knew It, comes from an article written by Rob Vandenberg earlier this year. You can see he published it in January of 2013, where he prophesied that translation, the way that we knew it, has come to an end with the discovery of big data, or with the rise of big data, that both the services that are being asked for as well as the services that are being delivered are not going to be the same anymore. Even as I read that last January, I went like, really? Is that what's going to happen? I don't think it is. I think there are some profound changes that we are experiencing, but to have these wide sweeping predictions that everything is going to change, well, it's kind of easy to make those in January of any given year, but it's truly, I think, is not going to happen so quickly. Plus, I think one of the areas that we are making mistakes sometimes is that we are talking about what we do and how we do it in a less than honest way, in a way that we pretend to be something that we are not. Here are some things that we are. Some of you will remember the earthquake, or most of you will remember the earthquake that hit Haiti in 2010. The earthquake was so profound and so violent that all communication lines between Haiti and the rest of the world were knocked out. But of course, as a response to the earthquake, hundreds of doctors and nurses and other rescue personnel came to Haiti and wanted to help, but really couldn't help very much, because the language that is spoken in Haiti, Haitian Creole, is not a language that is widely spoken elsewhere. So what could have been, there was no way to help that rescue personnel to in turn help the population there, if it wouldn't have been for a very ingenious idea that a researcher at Stanford University, Rob Monroe, had. The only line of communication that was still open between Haiti and the rest of the world was texting. You couldn't make calls, but you could still send texts out to the outside world. And what Rob did was he organized hundreds of expatriates, of people from Haiti who lived elsewhere in the US or Europe or South America, and had them translate short messages, texts that he received, then distribute to them. He received them back and he sent them on then to Haiti. The mission was called 4636, which was the number that rescuers were supposed to call. And amazingly enough, even though this sounds like a clumsy kind of effort, it wasn't clumsy at all for those hundreds of lives that have been saved. Nobody really knows how many lives have been saved, but the US military that was also in Haiti during that time assumes or estimates that that several hundred lives have in fact been saved by this effort. Interestingly, SMS is not something that you and I typically think about as translation technology. SMS, texting, we might do it on a daily basis and we might communicate with that, but is that translation technology? Well, in this particular context, it was the only translation technology that was there, and it was used to a very interesting and far-reaching extent. This next story here is a story that is relevant in a much more profound level, maybe even than the Haiti example. In the Haiti example, we talked about efforts that saved the lives of others, that saved lives of people in Haiti. Well, Haiti is far away, and what do we have to do with Haiti, aside from wanting to help, of course, but that doesn't really touch our lives. This story here touches your lives, and the lives of your parents, and the lives of your children, and the lives of your friends. You, in fact, may not be alive if this project wouldn't have started in Hong Kong in 1997. That was the year that the bird flu hit. In Hong Kong, being very well governed and being a very highly organized place, responded very well and very quickly by essentially killing all poultry in the whole territory of Hong Kong, and sort of eradicated bird flu, at least for the time being. And but at the same time, 2 Canadian scientists were in Hong Kong and looked at that, and they asked themselves, so what would have happened if this wouldn't have been Hong Kong, but it would have been the Chinese hinterland, or Mexico, or somewhere in the Congo, or in South America somewhere far away from large cities, and the possibility of such a concerted effort to eradicate that disease. So they eventually ended up creating a system where computers translate between 7 different languages: French, Persian, Chinese, Portuguese, Russian, and Spanish. They translate about 4,000 articles in those languages. And those articles don't come from the large metropolitan news outlets and media. Those come from very small outlets where maybe somebody is writing about strange occurrences of a great number of people with high fever, or where somebody writes about a rash that has developed among folks from a particular village, which all might be signs for an outbreak of a new kind of disease. And as we know from Hollywood movies, etc., those outbreaks need to be responded to very quickly. That is all done by machine translation, but what machine translation really only does is it looks at certain keywords, and it looks whether it finds certain keywords. If it finds those, it passes those on to a human translator. You might think, well, that's a nice idea, and it might work or might not work. Let me tell you, it does work. When SARS broke out in 2003 in China, and the swine flu broke out in 2009 in Mexico, this system found evidence of that outbreak 2 weeks prior to any other organization or any other effort, and the world was able to respond to those outbreaks much more quickly, and essentially not eradicating, but preventing much greater harm than could have been done. Those were just 2 examples that are well known, but of course there are many other examples that are not well known. So when I say this has truly saved your life or that of your family, I'm really not joking. So interestingly, we talked about the way that machine translates it and then needs to check with a human translator whether it's done a good job. Here is an example of an actual article that was published in the Tampa Tribune. Tampa is in Florida, and this was actually an article about a football team, the Bucks, the Tampa Bucks, Tampa Buccaneers, I think they're called, in Florida. And it read like this. It read, yellow fever, an epidemic of penalties that thwarted many drives, resulting in a 3-game losing streak and essentially leaving the Bucs season on life support. And you can imagine what the computer that all the alarm bells in the computer go off when it sees yellow fever and epidemic and life support, and that's exactly what happens. But rather than the computer, then alerting the UN blue helmets or white helmets or whatever they're called to rush to these places and do something, it is then being passed on to a human who looks at it and just smiles about it, because he immediately sees that this has nothing to do with a true epidemic that needs to be responded to. I love this story because it's a powerful example of how influential translation is, but I also love it because it shows the how machine translation is very powerful up to a certain degree. There's no way that 4,000 articles a day can be translated by humans. Well, there could be a way, but it's very unlikely that would happen. But it's very easily done by machine translation, and is then good to a certain degree, to the degree that it then needs to be checked by translators. So let's talk a little bit about technology and the translator. Here in the US, or really not just here in the US, but overall translation technology had its first rose to some kind of a prominence for the first time in 1954. This press release that is still up on the website at IBM details an experiment that's sometimes called the IBM Georgetown experiment, where a very large computer translated a Russian text consisting of, I think, 18 sentences or something into English. And the excitement about this was so great that the guy who ran this test, a guy by the name of Dostert, said, well, it's not yet possible to insert a Russian book on one end and come out with an English book on the other, but in 5, maybe 3 years from now, interlingual, meaning conversion by electronic process, in important functional areas of several languages might well be an accomplished fact. Well, you and I know that didn't happen. But you and I also know what did happen is that this 5-year rule was established, where it says, well, machine translation is really great and it's going to be perfect in 5 years from now. And it's kind of an ever-moving target. So once 1958 was reached, they said, well, it's really good, it has made progress, and in 5 years from now it's going to be perfect. And in 1963 and in 1968 and so on and so forth, they always said the same thing. Well, they weren't actually able to say that for a very long time, at least not officially, because in the US a commission was established called the LPEC Commission. It was a commission that was instituted by the US government to look at the feasibility of machine translation and how machine translation could truly help translation efforts. You got to imagine this is, of course, during the middle of the Cold War, where there was huge needs of translation from Russian into English, and of course on the other side of the continent it was from English into Russian, that happened in 1966. And interestingly, the central finding of this committee was that they said that while we have already noted that machine translation, machine-aided translation of general scientific text might be helpful, we do not have useful machine translation. Furthermore, there is no immediate or predictable prospect of useful machine translation. And then they recommended that that there should be a series of tools to aid the human translator in the process. And while it took a certain time to come to that point, they did in fact come out with tools that dictionary tools, terminology tools, etc., that aided the translator. translation industry responded to this by, oh, wait, there was no translation industry, right? At this point, really, the translation industry was not existent as we know it today. Technology had not yet had an impact that could be used to form larger companies, and while there were translators, there really was not a translation industry in that kind of sense. There was no association for translators, and there were no larger providers. In the 1980s and 1990s, digitization happened. That means that texts that before were on faxes or on paper of some kind were now electronic and could be processed by computers. So having the recommendation of that LPEC committee in mind, tools came about that provided for some quality assurance, which really often just consisted of spell checking, or provided for some terminology management, or of course provided for translation memory, which we now know is so much at the backbone of what we're doing today. And all of these three features essentially then combine into translation environment tools that you also might know as CAT tools. So how then did we respond to that? What's the response of the translation industry? And it was quite interesting, I think. The translation industry did in fact form because of this, the translation industry as we know it today. And the LSPs were very enthusiastic about this new technology because they saw it as a way to differentiate themselves from other language service providers, and most certainly from freelancers, because the freelancers accepted it only very, very slowly. The freelancers were very hesitant in adopting this new technology. And, well, you and I know, of course, how conservative freelancers, especially in the 1990s, as far as technologies were. They assumed that it would stifle their creativity. They assumed that they would lose their status as translators as they had defined themselves to that point. So translators really didn't take very much part in the process of developing these tools. They kind of stood on the sideline and complained about them rather than taking an active role in helping to make those tools into better tools. And what, of course, also happened is that new pricing models were created. Up to that point, typically there was an per word rate that was paid no matter how repetitive or of how much previous translation in a similar text had been done. The word rate was kind of the steady measuring stick for payment, but that of course changed, and the fuzzy match rates were introduced, repetition rates were introduced, and that really caused, I'm not so sure whether that happened so much in places like Russia and Ukraine, but in Europe and in the US that caused a huge, Western Europe I should say, in the UK and in the US, it caused a huge rift between freelance translators and language service providers. So that industry that was just being created sort of was torn apart at the same time by that rift between the two main actors in the industry, the freelancers on one side, the language service providers on the others. In the early 2000s then, and believe me, I'm going to be done with my little history lesson in a second here, but history is sometimes important to understand where we stand and what we do and how we need to respond now, how we need to learn from our mistakes that we might have committed in the past. In the early 2000s, the potentially translatable data grows exponentially. We all know why and how. There were so many new channels of communication, so much more data was being produced, and while of course not everything is being translated, the potentially translatable data grew beyond imagination. Social networks came up and increased and made the web, for one thing, much more multilingual, and also required a kind of translation that really was not considered to be true translation up to that point, the so-called gisting, or the approximate translation that could be provided by online machine translation engines such as Babelfish in the early days, Google Translate, or Microsoft Translator now. And lastly, to cap this all off and to round it all up, a new kind of machine translation came about that offered some really new and different kinds of possibilities. The kind of machine translation that had been around until about 2000 almost exclusively was the so-called rules-based machine translation, which means that the translation engine knew something about the source language and knew something about the target language, and in the process of translating it analyzed the source sentence, brought it into an intralingua, into a theoretical language, into a computer language, if you will, and then translated out of that into the target language. As we all, that was, for instance, what Babelfish was founded on, or was existed of. Babelfish, in fact, was run by the company Systran for a long time. Another company that you might be familiar with is the Russian company Prompt, or ProMT, that also, up to the present point, relies heavily on rules-based machine translation. This new machine translation, new kind of machine translation that came about in the 2000s was statistical machine translation, where it was possible to take very large corpora of texts in either monolingual or bilingual corpora and essentially overnight teach a computer a language. After the terrorist attacks in 2001, it was necessary to very, very, very quickly build up machine translation capabilities. Always thought that was important to build up machine translation capabilities, not in English and French and Russian and Spanish, which were the languages that was mostly focused on prior to that, but in languages like Pashto and Dari and Urdu and Persian and other languages where there was certainly nothing available for machine translation. And so the US government invested very, very heavily into this new technology, which very quickly found a decent level of maturity. And what this new technology also really did much better in than the rules-based machine translation were texts like we talked about earlier, like the social network text. You can imagine that on social networks, you don't always write in, grammatically correct sentences. You make lots of typos. All of these things are much easier captured with statistical machine translation based on data rather than rules-based machine translation, which is based on rules, and of course those rules don't necessarily apply to the kinds of text that are being produced every day right now. And really, that's the end of my presentation, if you will. Just like that, machine translation took over, and really the translation industry ended up to that that had developed was done for. So thank you very much. I'm just kidding, of course. Of course it didn't take over, right? What did take over is a sort of bragging about machine translation. This is, I shouldn't, poor Robert Etches that I've showed this tweet now for so many times doing talks, and I really shouldn't be doing that. But those kinds of comments are so typical now, and they're so wrong. Comments like the machine translation quality debate is dead. Over 75% of our language markets report the use of some form of MT solution. Well, Keith Lasker, who said that, who actually by this point has been fired from SDL, might have been able to prove it in some way or the other that number actually was correct. But really, the gist of his message is not correct. Machine translation, there are many stories about machine translation. In some cases, machine translation is being used quite effectively and quite well and quite intelligently, but much of the talk that you and I hear about machine translation is just hogwash right now. I strongly believe that much of it is talking something up that really doesn't work in the way that it's being talked about, not in a productive and high quality environment anyway. Often when I give talks to a real audience, not a digital audience, like in this case here, or virtual audience, like in this case, I ask those three questions here. I ask, so who is regularly working on MT projects? Or who is regularly using MT as a productivity tool, or has tried to use MT as a productivity tool? And I would say that, that's maybe 1,000 people that I've asked, or, maybe a few more that have asked those questions. Maybe 10% are saying, yes, machine translation is, I'm using that as a productivity tool day in and day out. Everybody has tried to use machine translation as a productivity tool. Everybody has gone to Google Translate. Every normal translator has, has tried to see what Google Translate could, how it could help him in his or her work. But in general, most have then, found that it is not of huge help. Some, on the other hand, have found it to be helpful. And of course, there is not just Google Translate, and that's really important to emphasize. There's Google Translate, a generic engine that is probably as good as a generic engine can be at this point. But there's also specific machine translation engines that are trained for a specific purpose, for with data that is client specific and subject specific, that is made towards having that machine translation being productive in a certain area. I don't know who of you has ever worked with an engine like that. I have, and it depends very much on many factors that this colleague of mine, Charlotte Brasler, and I discussed in this article here. Machine translation is often described as kind of a black and white thing. It's not black and white. Machine translation really is, there are 50 shades of gray to it. There's many, many different shades of gray to it. And so many things depend on who you are and where you stand. If you ask yourself whether you want to employ and use machine translation. One really important, and maybe the most important question, is what language combination are you translating into or out of? It makes a huge difference whether you are translating from, say, English into Swedish, which typically is considered to be a very good combination for machine translation, or if you're going from English into Russian, or English into German, or English into Hungarian, which all are languages that are considered not to be very helpful combinations. The European Union is using machine translation quite, there's a big push towards using machine translation with an engine that they developed for themselves. And there was an interesting article earlier this year about a survey that had been done among the European Union translators, or European Commission, I should say, translators, that were asked how effective machine translation is. And the interesting thing, and that's important for us to keep in mind, is that the evaluation depended very, very much on what kind of languages they were translating. It is of course not, if you look at the majority of 2 and 3 and 4 here, it's of course no surprise that between French and Spanish, French and Italian, and French and Portuguese, machine translation does quite well. But they're all Romanic languages, and clearly there is a great similarity between those languages. But if you then look at the left side of the column, where Translator said that translate from scratch outperforms any other benefit, but those languages, English into German, English into Estonian, English into Finnish, or English into Latvian, those languages have very few similarities on a syntactical level, and therefore are very difficult to translate with machine translation. Another consideration that you need to to make and do when you are trying to decide whether you should use machine translation. Does it make sense for your particular text type? Are you translating marketing material? And the answer, of course, then would be no. That would not be something where you should use machine translation for. Are you translating high quality text for an audience that expects flawless text, stylistically flawless text? No, machine translation should not be used for those. Are you translating texts that are where it's okay that where stylistic considerations are not part of the equation, or where it really doesn't matter what the result is unless as long as the message of the text is being communicated? Well, machine translation might in fact be a possibility for text like that. Next question that you should ask yourself, is if you are thinking about using machine translation, and you most likely will be thinking about using statistical machine translation, do you have data to train it with? Do you own the data that you could train it with? And do you have the expertise to train the machine translation on the basis of your data? There are a number, and I'm listing some here, there are a good number of statistical machine translation vendors right now who typically have developed their engines on the basis of the open source Moses engine, and have developed a much more user-friendly interface, and have developed algorithms to clean the data, the translation memory data that is being read into these tools. And yet the success of these engines, whatever success might be in this case, still depends very much on your expertise in handling the data as well. So don't assume that just because vendors like CantonMT or PangenMT or LetsMT says, well, it's really easy to train our data, you'll have quick success. That might in fact not be the case. Certainly not if you don't have the data, or also not if you don't have the expertise to evaluate your data and to prepare your data so it can be read into these tools. One tool that I would like to point out is the Microsoft Translator Hub, the last of the SMT engines that I'm mentioning here. The Translator Hub is interesting because what Microsoft is doing, Microsoft essentially is the biggest competitor to Google when it comes to a generic machine translation engine on the web, and what they have done to be able to collect more data than they have right now, and especially in languages that they cannot easily get data, where they cannot get easily get data from the web, is they have created an engine where you can feed your own data to create a machine translation engine on the basis of your data, which you can then use for almost free, and in return essentially donate your data to Microsoft, which will then use your data for other purposes as well. That's something that you can certainly not use for a project with confidential data, but it's a real possibility to look into that for projects where you have data that is not confidential and that you feel like you can easily essentially donate to Microsoft in return for an engine. But I also want to look at some smarter uses of MT. MT, typically we look at MT from the typical sort of post-editing model where we get raw machine translated data and then make sure it's being post-edited so it's stylistically and grammatically and content-wise correct. But there of course are other ways of using MT that are not mature yet, but that are being developed, and I think that are creating a much better opportunity for the use of machine translation for the professional translator. One area that really excites me is and machine translation based autocomplete. That doesn't sound so exciting at first, but just imagine that. Imagine a machine translation engine that interactively responds to your entry of target text. So you start to type your text, your translation, and with every word that you enter, the machine translation takes those entries into consideration by translating the source text and alters its suggestion based on what you are entering with every little bit of text that you are continuing to enter. So something that sounds a little futuristic, but it's also something that is being tried right now in some experimental tools, and something where I think we could easily agree on as translators that might be a great productivity boost. A productivity boost, just like translation memory is a productivity boost, or a good terminology database is a productivity boost, or spell checking is a productivity boost, right? I had a chance a few weeks ago to talk to Philipp Köhn, who is the father of, or who is the main person behind the open source Moses engine, which now is very widely used. And he said that there is a real interest on one hand to find out what translators actually would need to be more productive and to work more in a more positive manner with MT. But on the other hand, there's also a real disconnect because they don't really know, and they feel like there is very little ways to communicate with translators to get intelligent information. So if you're interested in communicating with the MT community, there are plenty of ways to do that, and there's plenty of ways for you to be involved right now and to mold machine translation into a tool that is not destroying your job, but is actually aiding your job as a translator. Another feature that is already being used, not to the degree that it could be, but there are some tools that are already doing it. Déjà Vu, for instance, is a feature called fuzzy match repair on the basis of MT. So that essentially would be a feature where you have a fuzzy translation memory match, so a match that is less than perfect. It's not 100% match. It's not exactly the same sentence that sits in your translation memory, but a sentence that has a slight difference to what you have previously translated. And the machine translation essentially is not retranslating the whole thing, but it's just translating the part of the segment that is that makes it fuzzy, the part of the segment that's different. And I think there is a lot of potential if that is being done more widely in tools. Or imagine a machine translation that would immediately learn on the basis of your input. So rather than learning in 3 or 4 weeks from now, as it is today with most engines that have to be recompiled, and once you've done with your translation and you enter it into the machine translation engine, it always takes a very long time to see your efforts being honored by the machine translation, if you will. Imagine a machine translation that immediately learns what you tell it to learn. So you correct the sentence, and the machine translation stores that knowledge and gives you suggestions in later segments based on your corrections. That also is a feature that is being tested right now, and has a lot of potential as well. So there are some things that are potentially huge aids for translators. So to come back though to the statement that we made earlier that machine translation has taken over, which I of course that is not quite true. I do think though that machine translation has taken over in one sense. It has taken over in showing how fragmented our industry is. we as an industry are we when you talk about an industry, you assume that an industry is a place where people compete with each other, and where or entities compete with each other, where the players in the industry provide a similar product, a similar service, where they all work on one level more or less. And I think that is truly not the case. If I've used this Chinese fan as an illustration of what I try to communicate what our industry looks like. There, just like in the Chinese fan, there is a common denominator, and that's the language, right? That's the little pin that holds the different strands of the fan together here. But aside from the language being one denominator, what one company offers has really very little to do with what another freelance translator offers, has very little to do with what a large LSP offers, has really nothing to do what maybe Google Translate offers, and so on and so forth. So the reason why I think that's an important point to make is there is a lot of arguing about the terrible effects that machine translation can have on our work lives. There is a lot of concern about what certain language service providers, what kind of services they provide, and why the poor quality of those services, etc. That might all be that there are huge differences in the quality of the services that we provide and that we sell, but that's a good thing. That's a good thing because it gives us an assurance that the kind of service that I want to provide to my client is unique. I am part of the language industry, I can say, but I'm going into a direction that is quite different to what, say, Linebridge or SDL or We Localize or Google or Microsoft is going into. And that should give us a lot of hope, I think, for what we are doing and who we are. So I think what we need to understand is we need to define and we need to find out what parts of the many facets of our industry I want to identify with, I want to be a part of, and I need to embrace those qualities. And then I need to really understand and realize that I have almost endless possibilities with what I have in those segments, what I can offer and work with in those segments. I want to tell you two more stories that also come from our Found in Translation book. And the reason I want to tell you those two stories is because those are, I think, fantastic examples of how powerful translation can be. The first one here is a translation this word is in Inuktitut. That's the language of the Inuit in northern Canada. And this word, I don't speak Inuktitut, and I assume that most of you don't either. But this word, I happen to know, this word is Ikiakivik. And Ikiakivik means internet. When modern technology arrived among the Inuits, they of course had to find words to describe things like internet and other things. And rather than borrowing these words from English like so many other languages, they wanted to find ways to reflect their traditional culture in those new concepts. So for the word of internet, they chose Ikiakivik, which originally meant that the shaman, the religious leaders, had to travel through certain layers of a spiritual world to talk to the dead and the living, to communicate with them for our sakes. And when I talked to an Inuit, Inuktitut translator about this, she said, well, that really is what the internet is like, isn't it? It's you travel through layers and you talk to all kinds of people and you get information about your own life by doing that. The reason why I'm telling you this story is because I think that after hearing the story, you will never view internet in the same way. You will never learn Inuktitut. Chances are you won't. And it's a language with about 20,000 speakers today, and really it's on a worldwide scale. It's not an important language, but because Inuktitut was able to express internet in that kind of manner, the concept of internet has changed for everyone who hears that story. So translation can have a profound impact on all of us on an ongoing basis, no matter whether we actually know the language or not. This man here just died just 9 months ago or 10 months ago. His name is Michael Henry Hein, and he was a very well-known translator from various, mostly Eastern European languages into English. And one of the languages that he was particularly strong at was Czech. He was the translator of well-known authors like Milan Kundera or others. And when Czechoslovakia fell apart into two countries, Slovakia on the one hand and the other country on the other hand, the leaders of the other country that didn't have a name at that point didn't know what to name their country. But what they did know is that translators, more than anyone else, create language, create words, create concepts, are creators of what we use day in and day out. So they called Michael Henry Hein, who was living in Los Angeles at that point, and said, Michael, we need to name our country. What do we name our country? And Michael thought about it for a little while, and he said, Czech Republic. And that's the name that this country has up to the present point, as you know. Translators create language. Translators change the world day in and day out. So really what we should not focus on is what, the title of this talk was The End of the World for Translation as We Knew It. What we should focus on is this, the end of the world for translation as they knew it. Because we should have a whole different attitude towards translation and to our own importance in the way that we present what we do to the outside world. That's so important. It's the self-image that determines how we can project ourselves, how we can explain who we are. If we go around and say, oh, I'm just a translator, well, that's not something we can do to gain respect. But if we can say, I'm one of those, I'm a translator, and I'm one of those that save the world every day, that make sure that your family is alive, that creates concepts and whole worlds in your mind, and that names countries in the process, that is a whole different thing than saying, I'm just a translator. Thank you very much. I obviously in this recording you won't be able to ask any questions, but you can contact me at the email down below. You can also subscribe to my Twitter feed at JeromeWobot. And I would encourage you also to go to my website at internationalwriters.com and subscribe to my newsletter. There's a free edition and a paid edition. Just subscribe to the free edition first, and then if you like it, you can later on then get the paid edition. And I'm also good friends with the folks at Multilingual Magazine, and they are always happy to have me give away some free subscriptions. If you go to multilingual.com/promo and enter the code D913SF, you will get, I think, 4 months of a free subscription for the magazine. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you have benefited in some way from this webinar here, and I hope that that I'll hear from you at some point by email or otherwise. Thank you very much.